morning sun barely touched the windows of Westfield Community College when Rosa Martinez arrived for her cleaning shift. At 45, she moved through the empty hallways like a ghost, her footsteps quiet on the polished floors. Most people never really saw her. To them, she was just part of the background, someone who emptied their trash and wiped down their desks. Rosa had been working at the college for 3 years now. Every day, she followed the same routine. Start with the main building, work through the classrooms, then finish with the music department. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. More importantly, it allowed her to take evening classes for free. At her age, going back to school wasn't easy, but Rosa was determined to finish the degree she'd started 25 years ago. The music department was always her favorite part of the job. Something about the place felt different from the rest of the college. Even when it was empty, the walls seemed to hold echoes of beautiful sounds. Rosa would clean the practice rooms one by one, carefully dusting the piano keys and straightening the sheet music that students left scattered around. Sometimes, if she was running late with her cleaning, she'd still be working when the evening students arrived. She'd watch them through the small windows in the practice room doors, young faces full of hope and ambition, their fingers dancing across piano keys or drawing bows across violin strings. Rosa always smiled when she saw them. They reminded her of herself long ago in a different life. The main rehearsal hall was Rosa's last stop each day. It housed a beautiful grand piano that gleamed black under the overhead lights. Rosa took special care with this instrument. She'd learned from the music professors that it was worth more than most people's houses. Every day she dusted it gently, polished its surface until it shone, and carefully cleaned each key. What nobody knew was that Rosa understood exactly how precious this piano was. Not just because of its price tag, but because of what it represented. When she looked at those ivory keys, memories flooded back. Memories of other pianos, other stages, other times when music filled her life instead of just her dreams. But that was the past. Now Rosa was just the cleaning lady. She wore a simple blue uniform with her name embroidered on the pocket. Her gray hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried her supplies in a cart that squeaked slightly as she pushed it down the halls. To everyone at Westfield Community College, she was invisible. The students would rush past her without a second glance, their minds on exams and assignments. The professors would nod politely if they happened to make eye contact, but they never really saw her as a person with her own story. Rosa didn't mind. She'd learned long ago that being invisible had its advantages. People left you alone to do your work in peace. But late at night, when the building was empty and Rosa was finishing her final tasks, she would sometimes pause by the practice rooms. If a piece of sheet music was left open on a piano, she might glance at it. Her eyes would scan the notes, and despite herself, her fingers would twitch slightly, as if remembering how to move across keys. Rosa had trained herself not to linger too long in these moments. She had work to finish, evening classes to attend, and a life to live. Music was her past, not her present. She'd made peace with that choice years ago, or at least she told herself she had. The other custodial staff liked Rosa well enough. She was quiet but friendly, always willing to cover an extra shift if someone needed help. During their lunch breaks, they'd sometimes ask her about her evening classes. Rosa would tell them about her business courses, how she hoped to maybe start a small cleaning company someday. It was a reasonable dream, practical and achievable. What Rosa never mentioned was how her heart still jumped every time she heard piano music drifting from the practice rooms. She never talked about the nights when she lay awake, her fingers unconsciously moving through scales and arpeggios under her blanket. She never shared how sometimes, in her dreams, she was back on stage, dressed in elegant black, her hands flying across keys while an audience held its breath. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now. The woman who had once played in concert halls and competition stages seemed as distant as a character from a book. Rosa Martinez, the cleaning lady taking night classes, was who she was now. It was a good life, an honest life, even if it was quiet. As the weeks passed, Rosa noticed that the music students were preparing for something special. There were more late-night practices, more excited conversations in the hallways. Posters appeared on bulletin boards advertising the annual faculty talent show. Rosa read them while she cleaned the glass cases that housed them. It sounded like a nice event, she thought. A chance for the professors to show off their skills outside the classroom. Rosa didn't imagine for a second that she would ever be part of such an event. Why would she be? She was just the cleaning lady after all. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, and Rosa's surprise was just around the corner, waiting to change everything she thought she knew about her quiet, invisible life at Westfield Community College. It was a Tuesday morning when everything started to change for Rosa. She was cleaning the main rehearsal hall just like every other day, when Professor Williams walked in looking more frazzled than usual. His gray hair was messier than normal, and he kept checking his phone with a worried expression. Rosa had seen Professor Williams around the music department for 3 years now. He taught piano and was known for being kind but scattered. Students often joked that he'd lose his head if it wasn't attached to his shoulders. Today he looked particularly stressed as he paced around the room muttering to himself. "Good morning, Professor," Rosa said quietly, continuing to dust the piano bench. She always tried to be polite to the faculty, even though most of them barely noticed her. Professor Williams looked up, seemingly surprised to find someone else in the room. "Oh, hello there." He paused, clearly trying to remember her name. "Rosa," she offered with a small smile. "Right. Rosa. Sorry, I'm just having a terrible morning." He ran his hands through his hair, making it even messier. "The faculty talent show is in 3 weeks, and I'm supposed to have the final list of performers to the dean by Friday. But half the people who signed up have backed out." Rosa nodded sympathetically while continuing her work. She'd heard professors complaining about various college events before. It seemed like organizing anything was always more complicated than it should be. "Professor Martinez called in sick, so that's our violin piece gone," Williams continued, apparently needing someone to vent to. "And Dr. Johnson decided she's too busy with her research to participate. That leaves us with only 4 acts for what's supposed to be a showcase of our department's talent." "I'm sure you'll figure something out," Rosa said, moving to clean the windows. She wasn't really sure what else to say. Faculty problems weren't exactly her area of expertise. Professor Williams slumped into a chair and stared at the grand piano. "We need at least 8 performers. The dean specifically requested a substantial program this year. Last year's show was apparently disappointingly brief." He made air quotes with his fingers. Rosa finished with the windows and started organizing the sheet music that was scattered across the piano. She couldn't help but notice what pieces they were. Some Chopin, a bit of Mozart, and several contemporary compositions she didn't recognize. "Do you play?" Professor Williams asked suddenly. Rosa looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "Piano. Do you play piano?" He was looking at her with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time. Rosa felt her heart skip a beat. "A little," she said carefully. "When I was younger." It wasn't exactly a lie. She had played when she was younger. She just left out the part about being professionally trained and winning international competitions. That felt like information from another lifetime, irrelevant to who she was now. Professor Williams' eyes lit up. "Really? That's wonderful. We're desperate for more performers. Would you consider participating in the talent show?" "Oh no," Rosa said quickly, shaking her head. "I couldn't possibly. I mean, I just play a little bit. Nothing fancy. I wouldn't belong in a faculty showcase. Nonsense." Professor Williams stood up, suddenly energized. "This isn't Carnegie Hall. It's just a friendly college event. We need warm bodies more than we need perfection. Besides, it would be nice to have some staff representation. Show that the whole college community is involved." Rosa continued, shaking her head. "Really, I don't think it's a good idea. I haven't played seriously in years. I'd probably embarrass myself." But Professor Williams was warming to the idea now. "Tell you what, you don't have to do anything complicated. Just a simple piece, maybe 5 minutes long. Something you're comfortable with. The audience will love it. A heartwarming story about our dedicated staff member sharing her hidden talent." Rosa felt trapped. How could she explain that her hidden talent was far more complicated than he could imagine? How could she tell him that she'd once played in concert halls across Europe, that she'd studied with masters, that her fingers still remembered pieces that would make his head spin? "I really don't think," she started to say. "Think about it," Professor Williams interrupted. "Just think about it. We really need the help, and I have a feeling you're being too modest about your abilities." Before Rosa could protest further, the door opened and Professor Chen walked in. She taught voice and was known for being very enthusiastic about everything. "David," she called to Professor Williams, "any luck finding more performers for the show?" "Actually, yes." Professor Williams beamed. Rosa here might be willing to play piano for us." Professor Chen turned to Rosa with delight. "Oh, how wonderful. We love it when staff members participate. It really brings the whole college together." Rosa felt even more cornered now. "I was just telling Professor Williams that I don't really—" "She's being modest," Professor Williams said. "Says she plays a little bit. You know how people are about their talents." "That's so typical," Professor Chen agreed. "People always downplay their abilities. I bet you're much better than you think, Rosa. And honestly, the bar isn't that high. This is supposed to be fun, not a professional audition." More faculty members started filtering into the rehearsal hall for what Rosa realized must be a scheduled meeting. Professor Williams took the opportunity to share his discovery with everyone. "Great news, everyone. Rosa has agreed to consider playing piano for the talent show." "That's fantastic," said Dr. Thompson from the music history department. "How exciting," added Professor Lee, who taught guitar. Rosa found herself surrounded by enthusiastic faculty members, all encouraging her to participate. The more she protested, the more they seemed convinced she was just being humble. Nobody seemed to consider that she might have real reasons for not wanting to perform. "What would you like to play?" Professor Martinez asked. He'd just arrived and was catching up on the conversation. "Oh, she hasn't decided yet," Professor Williams answered for her. "I was thinking something classical but not too challenging. Maybe some Chopin? Nothing too fancy." Rosa's heart sank. Chopin was exactly the kind of composer that had defined her previous life. Even his simple pieces required years of training to play properly. "The minute waltz could be nice," suggested Professor Chen. "It's recognizable and pleasant." "Or maybe Für Elise," added Dr. Thompson. "Everyone loves that piece." Rosa wanted to point out that Für Elise was actually by Beethoven, not Chopin, but she kept quiet. These people meant well, but they clearly didn't understand what they were asking of her. "Why don't you think about it over the weekend?" Professor Williams suggested kindly. "No pressure at all. Just consider it. We'd really appreciate the help, and I think you might surprise yourself with how well you do." As the faculty members dispersed to start their meeting, Rosa finished her cleaning quickly and left the room. Her hands were shaking slightly as she pushed her cart down the hallway. She'd spent 3 years successfully staying invisible, keeping her past buried where it belonged. But now, with one innocent question from a desperate professor, her carefully constructed new life was starting to crack. The problem wasn't that she couldn't play piano for their little talent show. The problem was that she could play too well. And once she sat down at that piano, there would be no hiding who she really was anymore. For the next 4 days, Rosa couldn't escape the talent show. Everywhere she went in the music department, faculty members would stop her with encouraging smiles and gentle questions about her decision. They were all so kind, so hopeful that saying no became harder with each conversation. "Any thoughts about the talent show, Rosa?" Professor Chen would ask cheerfully when Rosa cleaned her office. "We're really counting on you," Professor Williams would say with a warm smile when they passed in the hallway. Even Professor Martinez, who was usually too busy to chat, stopped her on Thursday morning. "I heard you might play piano for us." "That's wonderful. Music brings people together, you know. It doesn't matter if you're a professor or a janitor. When you make music, you're an artist." Rosa appreciated his sentiment, but it made her stomach twist with anxiety. If only he knew that she'd once been introduced on stage as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. If only any of them knew. The pressure wasn't mean-spirited. These were good people who genuinely needed help with their event. But Rosa felt like she was being slowly backed into a corner with no way out, except to reveal the truth about her past. And that wasn't something she was ready to do. Friday afternoon brought the crisis to a head. Rosa was cleaning the main rehearsal hall when Professor Williams burst through the door, looking more panicked than she'd ever seen him. "Rosa, thank goodness you're here." He was slightly out of breath, as if he'd been running. "I just got off the phone with the dean. She wants to invite some potential donors to the talent show. These are people who might fund our new music wing. We absolutely have to have a strong program now." Rosa's heart sank. "Professor Williams, I really don't think—" "Please," he interrupted, and his voice was genuinely desperate. "I know I've been asking a lot, but we're in real trouble here. Professor Davis just called. She broke her wrist and can't play violin. That's another performer gone. We're down to 3 acts, and one of them is Dr. Johnson reading poetry about mathematics." Despite her anxiety, Rosa almost smiled at that. Dr. Johnson's poetry was unique. Look, Professor Williams continued, pulling out a folder of sheet music. I found some pieces that would be perfect for someone with your level of experience. Nothing too complicated, I promise. He spread several pieces across the piano. Rosa glanced at them and felt her breath catch. There was Chopin's Heroic Polonaise, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the standard repertoire. Next to it was Liszt's La Campanella, another virtuoso showpiece. These weren't simple pieces for an amateur. Professor Williams, Rosa said carefully, these are quite difficult. I don't think you understand what you're asking. Oh, don't worry about that, he said dismissively. I don't expect you to play them exactly as written. Just do a simplified version. Play the melody, skip the hard parts. The important thing is that you participate. Rosa stared at the sheet music. The idea of playing a simplified version of the Heroic Polonaise was almost painful to consider. It would be like asking someone to paint a simplified version of the Mona Lisa. I could find something easier, she suggested weakly. No, Professor Williams insisted. The dean specifically mentioned that she hopes to see some classical repertoire. These pieces are perfect. They sound impressive even when simplified. Plus, if we put Chopin and Liszt on the program, it looks much more sophisticated. Rosa felt like she was trapped in an impossible situation. If she played these pieces properly, she'd reveal herself as far more than a casual amateur. But if she played them badly, she'd be doing a disservice to music that had once been central to her life. Professor Williams, she tried one more time. Maybe you could find another faculty member, or ask one of your advanced students. I've asked everyone, he said, slumping into a chair. The students are all too nervous to perform for potential donors, and the faculty are either already in the show or have refused. Rosa, you're literally my last hope. If you say no, I'll have to go to the dean and tell her we can't provide the kind of program she's expecting. Rosa saw the genuine worry in his eyes. Professor Williams was a good man who cared about his department. The music program at Westfield wasn't prestigious, but it gave students opportunities they might not have elsewhere. If the talent show failed and the donors weren't impressed, it could hurt the entire department. If I agree, Rosa said slowly, could we maybe choose something less ambitious? Professor Williams' face lit up with hope. Of course, whatever you're comfortable with. Though, he added quickly, it would be great if we could list at least one recognizable classical composer on the program, for the donors. Rosa picked up the Chopin piece and studied it. She knew every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle phrasing that made it magnificent. She could play it in her sleep, and sometimes in her dreams she did. This one, she said quietly, holding up the Heroic Polonaise. Professor Williams beamed. Excellent choice. That's perfect. Just remember, don't stress about playing it perfectly. Do what you can and the audience will appreciate the effort. Rosa nodded, though something inside her rebelled at the idea of giving anything less than her best to this piece. When is the show again? 2 weeks from tomorrow. That gives you plenty of time to work on it. And Rosa? Professor Williams's voice was warm with gratitude. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me, to all of us. After he left, Rosa stood alone in the rehearsal hall, holding the sheet music. She looked at the grand piano, its black surface reflecting the overhead lights. For 3 years, she'd walked past this instrument every day, careful not to touch the keys, careful not to remember. Now she was committed to sitting at this piano in front of an audience that included potential donors and college administrators. She was committed to playing one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire, while everyone expected her to struggle through a simplified version. Rosa sat down on the piano bench and opened the music. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She hadn't played this piece in over 15 years, but her fingers remembered. They always remembered. Very quietly, almost afraid someone might hear, she played the opening chords. The sound filled the empty rehearsal hall, rich and powerful and absolutely perfect. For a moment, Rosa forgot where she was. She forgot about cleaning supplies and evening classes and the life she'd built as an invisible person. For just a moment, she was herself again. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly closed the piano lid. She gathered her cleaning supplies and hurried out of the room, her heart pounding. 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, she would either have to reveal who she really was, or figure out how to hide her abilities while still helping the people who had been kind to her. Either way, Her quiet, invisible life at Westfield Community College was about to change forever. That weekend, Rosa made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't bring herself to play the heroic Polonaise badly, but she also wasn't ready to reveal her true abilities, so she chose a middle path. She would practice in secret, late at night when the building was empty. Monday evening, after her regular cleaning shift ended, Rosa made her way back to the music department. She had her own key card that allowed her access for emergency cleaning, and she'd never used it for anything else. Tonight felt like an emergency of a different kind. The hallways were dark and quiet as Rosa walked toward the main rehearsal hall. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors. She felt like she was doing something forbidden, even though technically she had permission to be in the building. Rosa unlocked the rehearsal hall and slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. She turned on just one small lamp instead of the overhead lights, creating a pool of warm yellow light around the grand piano. The rest of the room disappeared into shadows. She sat on the piano bench and opened the Chopin music with shaking hands. It had been so long since she'd attempted to play anything seriously. What if her fingers had forgotten? What if 20 years of silence had stolen her abilities? Rosa placed her hands on the keys and began the opening phrases of the heroic Polonaise very slowly. The notes came hesitantly at first, like a conversation with an old friend you hadn't spoken to in years. But gradually muscle memory took over. Her fingers found their way across the keys with increasing confidence. The piece began to come alive under her hands. The powerful opening chords, the flowing melodic lines, the thunderous passages that gave the piece its name, it all started to return. Rosa found herself sitting straighter, her arms moving with the old familiar grace she'd learned decades ago. For the first time in 20 years, Rosa allowed herself to truly play. She worked on the piece section by section, the way her old teacher had trained her. First the right hand alone, then the left hand, then both hands together slowly. She paid attention to every detail, the phrasing, the dynamics, the subtle pedaling that brought out the harmonic colors. Time disappeared. Rosa had no idea how long she'd been playing when she heard a sound that made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway outside. She quickly closed the piano lid and turned off the lamp, her heart pounding. The footsteps passed by without stopping, probably a security guard making his rounds. Rosa waited in the darkness for several minutes before she dared to turn the light back on. This became her routine. Every night after her cleaning shift, Rosa would return to the rehearsal hall and practice. She told herself she was just making sure she could play the piece well enough not to embarrass Professor Williams. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Playing again awakened something in Rosa that she'd buried for too long. The joy of making music, the satisfaction of technical mastery, the emotional connection she felt to the great composers. It all came flooding back. Each night she found herself staying a little longer, playing a little more freely. By the end of the first week, Rosa was playing the heroic Polonaise better than she had in years. Her fingers had regained their strength and agility. Her musical instincts, dormant but not dead, had reawakened. She found herself adding subtle interpretative touches that would have made her old teacher proud, but Rosa didn't stop with just the assigned piece. Once she'd mastered the Polonaise, she found herself drawn to other music. She played Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto from memory, her fingers dancing through the complex passages as if no time had passed at all. She attempted Liszt's La Campanella and was amazed to find she could still navigate its technical challenges. One night, she even played some of the competition pieces from her youth, the ones that had won her prizes and recognition in another life. Chopin's ballads, Beethoven's late sonatas, Debussy's images. Each piece brought back memories of concert halls and competitions, of the young woman she'd been before life forced her to make different choices. The security guards had noticed the lights in the music building, but Rosa was careful to clean as she went, leaving no evidence of her late-night sessions. To anyone checking, it would just look like she was doing her job thoroughly. During the day, Rosa continued her regular routine. She cleaned, attended her evening business classes, and politely answered questions about her upcoming performance. Professor Williams would check in with her regularly, always offering encouragement and reminding her not to worry about perfection. "Just do your best," he'd say with a kind smile. "That's all anyone can ask." If only he knew that her best was far beyond anything he could imagine. Rosa's fellow cleaning staff noticed she seemed different lately. More energetic somehow. She hummed softly while she worked, and there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. "You seem happy lately," observed Janet, who worked the day shift in the administrative building. "Must be excited about that talent show." "I suppose I am," Rosa replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. Despite her anxiety about the performance, she was excited. For the first time in 20 years, she was making music again. The second week of practice brought new challenges. Rosa's technique was fully restored now, and she was playing the heroic Polonaise with all the power and nuance it deserved. But that created a new problem. How could she perform this way without revealing her true background? She experimented with playing a simplified version, the way Professor Williams expected. But every time she tried to leave out the complex passages or dumb down the musical interpretation, it felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about music. As the performance date approached, Rosa realized she was facing an impossible choice. She could play badly and disappoint herself, or she could play well and face questions she wasn't ready to answer. Late Thursday night, sitting alone at the grand piano, Rosa made her decision. She placed her hands on the keys and played the heroic Polonaise one more time, with all the skill and passion she possessed. The music filled the empty hall, powerful and beautiful and true. When the last notes faded into silence, Rosa knew what she had to do. She couldn't hide her abilities anymore, and she couldn't dishonor the music by playing it poorly. Tomorrow night she would sit at this piano in front of an audience and play exactly as she was meant to play. Whatever happened afterward, she would deal with it. But for the first time in 20 years, Rosa was going to let people see who she really was. As she locked up the rehearsal hall for the last time, as her secret practice space, Rosa felt both terrified and free. The quiet, invisible life she'd built was about to end, but maybe, just maybe, it was time for something new to begin. As Rosa sat at the piano during her final secret practice session, memories flooded back with startling clarity. The woman who now cleaned floors and studied business at night had once been someone entirely different. Her name then was Rosa Elena Volkov, and she had been destined for greatness. It started when she was 6 years old in a small apartment in Prague. Her grandmother owned an old upright piano that took up half their tiny living room. While other children played with dolls, Rosa would climb onto the bench and pick out melodies by ear. Her grandmother, who had once played in the Prague Symphony, recognized something special in the little girl's musical instincts. "This child has music in her soul," she told Rosa's parents. "We must find her a teacher." Rosa's parents worked multiple jobs to afford piano lessons. Her father was a mechanic who also drove a taxi at night. Her mother cleaned offices and took in sewing to earn extra money. They sacrificed everything so their daughter could study with the best teachers in Prague. By age 12, Rosa was performing in youth competitions across Eastern Europe. Her small hands could already navigate pieces that challenged adult musicians. Teachers began calling her a prodigy, comparing her to the great pianists of previous generations. When she was 15, Rosa won the International Young Musicians Competition in Vienna. The prize included a full scholarship to study at the Moscow Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Her parents wept with joy as she packed her bags for Russia. At the conservatory, Rosa studied with Viktor Petrov, a legendary teacher whose students had won competitions around the globe. He was demanding and often harsh, but he saw Rosa's potential immediately. "You have the hands of an angel and the heart of a lion," he told her during her first lesson. "But technique and emotion mean nothing without discipline. I will teach you to be not just a pianist, but an artist." Rosa threw herself into her studies. She practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. She learned not just the notes on the page, but the history behind each piece, the composer's intentions, the cultural context that gave the music meaning. She studied languages so she could perform around the world. She learned about performance psychology to manage stage nerves. By age 20, Rosa was performing with major orchestras across Europe. Critics praised her mature interpretation and technical brilliance beyond her years. She won the prestigious Chopin competition in Warsaw, and suddenly everyone in the classical music world knew her name. The next 5 years were a whirlwind of concerts, recordings, and international travel. Rosa performed at Carnegie Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Vienna State Opera. Her recording of Rachmaninoff's piano concertos became a bestseller. Music magazines featured her on their covers, calling her the future of classical piano. But success came with pressure. Rosa's schedule was brutal. Sometimes she performed in different countries on consecutive nights. She rarely had time to visit her family, who had moved to a small town outside Prague with the money she was earning. She was lonely, surrounded by people but with few real friends. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Rosa was in her hotel room in London, preparing for a concert at Royal Festival Hall when her manager called with devastating news. There had been an accident back home. A drunk driver had hit her parents' car head-on. Her father died instantly. Her mother was in critical condition. Rosa flew home immediately, canceling weeks of performances. Her mother survived, but the injuries left her partially paralyzed and needing constant care. Rosa's younger brother, Miguel, who had been in the car, suffered brain damage that left him mentally disabled but alive. Suddenly, Rosa faced an impossible choice. Her career was at its peak. She had contracts signed for the next 2 years, recording deals worth millions and opportunities that most musicians could only dream of. But her family needed her. Her mother required expensive medical care, and Miguel would need supervision for the rest of his life. The classical music world doesn't pause for personal tragedies. Rosa's manager was sympathetic but firm. If she took time off now, other pianists would take her place. The next generation was always waiting in the wings. Rosa chose her family. She moved back to Prague and used her savings to pay for her mother's medical bills and Miguel's care. She took whatever work she could find, teaching piano to wealthy children, playing background music at restaurants, performing at weddings. It wasn't the career she'd trained for, but it paid the bills. As the years passed, the classical music world forgot Rosa Elena Volkov. New young pianists emerged. Critics found new favorites, and her name disappeared from concert programs. Rosa told herself she was at peace with her decision. Family was more important than fame, but life had one more cruel turn. When Rosa was 37, her mother died unexpectedly from complications related to her injuries. Miguel's condition worsened, and he needed to be moved to a specialized care facility. Rosa used the last of her savings to pay for his treatment. With no money and no recent performance credits, Rosa found herself truly alone for the first time in her life. The classical music world had moved on without her, and she had no connections outside of music. She was a world-class pianist with no world to play in. That's when she met Luis Martinez, a kind man who worked in construction and happened to live in the same building where Rosa was renting a tiny apartment. Luis was divorced with 2 teenage children who lived with their mother. He was gentle and practical, the opposite of the intense artistic world Rosa had known. They married after a year, and Luis helped Rosa see that she could build a different kind of life. When his construction company got a contract to work in America, they decided to immigrate together. Rosa took his last name and left her musical past behind, but the marriage didn't last. Luis was a good man, but they were too different. After 3 years, they divorced amicably. Rosa kept his name because by then, Rosa Volkov belonged to a life that no longer existed. She found work cleaning buildings because it was steady and didn't require references from her previous life. She enrolled in night school because she needed practical skills for a practical future. She learned to be invisible because it was safer than explaining who she used to be. Now, sitting at the grand piano in Westfield's rehearsal hall, Rosa remembered all of it. The triumph and the tragedy, the choices and the consequences. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed everything for Rosa's musical education. She thought about Miguel, still in his care facility, who would clap with delight whenever Rosa played for him during her rare visits. Most of all, she thought about the young woman who had once commanded stages around the world, with nothing but her hands and her heart. That woman wasn't gone. She had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up, tomorrow night. In front of faculty and donors who expected a humble janitor to stumble through a simplified classical piece, Rosa Elena Volkov would perform again. Not because she wanted fame or recognition, but because music deserved to be played with love and skill and truth. For the first time in 20 years, Rosa was ready to remember who she really was. The day of the talent show arrived gray and drizzly, matching Rosa's nervous mood. She went through her regular cleaning routine, but her hands shook slightly as she dusted and straightened. Every few minutes, she'd catch herself running through fingering patterns in the air, muscle memory preparing for what lay ahead. Professor Williams found her around noon, practically bouncing with excitement and anxiety. "Rosa, how are you feeling? Ready for tonight?" His smile was bright, but she could see the worry in his eyes. The success of this evening meant everything to the music department. "I'm ready," Rosa said simply, though her stomach was doing flips. "Remember, don't put pressure on yourself," he said kindly. "Just do your best with the piece. The audience will love seeing someone from our staff participate. It's really about community spirit, not perfection." Rosa nodded, wishing she could tell him that perfection wasn't something she was worried about avoiding. It was something she couldn't help delivering. As evening approached, Rosa went home to her small apartment to get ready. She stood in front of her closet looking at her limited options. Most of her clothes were practical, work uniforms, casual outfits for school, nothing suitable for performing. Finally, she settled on a simple black dress she'd bought for her ex-husband's company Christmas party years ago. It was elegant but not flashy, appropriate but not attention-grabbing. She pulled her graying hair back into a neat bun and applied just a touch of makeup. Looking in the mirror, she saw a middle-aged woman who could blend into any crowd. But her hands still remembered what it felt like to perform. Rosa arrived at the college early, wanting to check the piano one last time. The auditorium was already bustling with activity. Student volunteers were setting up chairs and adjusting lights. Faculty members rushed around with clipboards and concerned expressions. "Rosa," Professor Chen spotted her immediately. "You look lovely. Are you excited?" "A little nervous," Rosa admitted. "That's perfectly normal. Everyone gets stage fright. Just remember, we're all rooting for you." Rosa made her way to the backstage area, which was really just a side hallway where performers could wait. The other acts were already gathering. Professor Williams with his saxophone, Dr. Thompson, who apparently played folk guitar, and Professor Davis's replacement, a young graduate student who would be playing violin. They all greeted Rosa warmly, treating her like one of the team. She appreciated their kindness even as she felt like she was living a lie. "What are you playing again?" asked the graduate student Lisa. "Chopin's Heroic Polonaise," Rosa answered. Professor Williams beamed proudly. Rosa's being modest about her abilities, but I have a feeling she's going to surprise us all. If only he knew how right he was. The auditorium began filling up as 7 o'clock approached. Rosa peeked through the curtain and saw faculty members, staff, students, and several people in expensive suits who must be the potential donors. The audience was larger than she'd expected, maybe 200 people. Dean Patricia Robertson took the stage to welcome everyone. She was an elegant woman in her 60s who commanded respect with her presence alone. "Welcome to our annual faculty talent show," she began. "Tonight you'll see a different side of our music department faculty and staff. These performances demonstrate the creativity and passion that make Westfield such a special place to learn and work." Rosa's heart pounded as the dean continued, mentioning the potential donors and the importance of supporting the arts. No pressure at all. The show began with Professor Williams playing a jazzy saxophone piece. He was actually quite good, and the audience responded warmly. Dr. Thompson followed with a folk song that had people swaying along. The graduate student's violin performance was technically solid, if a bit nervous. Then Dean Robertson returned to the microphone. "Our next performer represents the heart of what makes Westfield special, the dedication of our entire community to learning and growth. Rosa Martinez works in our custodial staff while pursuing her business degree in our evening program. Tonight she'll be performing Chopin's Heroic Polonaise. Please welcome Rosa." The applause was warm and encouraging as Rosa walked onto the stage. She could see friendly faces in the audience. Her fellow custodial workers had come to support her, along with students from her business classes. Everyone was smiling at her with affection and modest expectations. Rosa sat at the grand piano and adjusted the bench. This was the same instrument she'd cleaned every day for 3 years, but now it felt different under her hands. Now it was her partner, ready to help her create something beautiful. She placed her hands on the keys and paused. In that moment of silence, Rosa made a final decision. She would not play a simplified version. She would not hide her abilities. She would honor the music, the composer, and her own 20 years of silence with a performance worthy of all. 3. Rosa began the opening, chords of the heroic Polonaise. The first notes rang out with power and clarity that surprised everyone in the audience. These weren't the tentative sounds of an amateur struggling with a difficult piece. These were the commanding tones of a master musician announcing her presence. As Rosa moved into the main theme, the change in the audience was immediate. People sat up straighter. Conversation stopped. Even the donors, who had been politely attentive during the other performances, were now completely focused on the stage. Rosa played with the full force of her restored technique and 20 years of suppressed musical emotion. Her fingers flew through the complex passages with ease and precision. The thunderous climaxes shook the auditorium, while the gentle melodic sections sang with heartbreaking beauty. But it wasn't just technical mastery. It was the interpretation that transformed the performance from impressive to transcendent. Rosa played with the deep musical understanding that only comes from years of professional experience. She knew when to push forward and when to hold back, when to let the music breathe and when to drive it with relentless energy. The heroic Polonaise is a piece about triumph over adversity, about finding strength in struggle. As Rosa played, her own story poured into the music. Every sacrifice she'd made, every dream she'd buried, every year of silence, it all found voice in Chopin's magnificent composition. Professor Williams stood in the wings with his mouth open, barely breathing. This wasn't the simple performance he'd expected from his modest custodian. This was artistry at the highest level. In the audience, people began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some pulled out their phones to record, though most were too mesmerized to look away. The potential donors leaned forward in their seats, recognizing professional-level musicianship when they heard it. As Rosa reached the final climactic passages, her years of professional training showed in every gesture. Her posture was perfect. Her arms moved with balletic grace, her fingers produced sounds from the piano that seemed impossible. This was how the piece was meant to be played, with power, passion, and absolute technical mastery. The final chords rang out like triumphant bells, filling every corner of the auditorium. Rosa held her hands on the keys for a moment after the sound faded, her eyes closed, lost in the music that had carried her back to herself. For a heartbeat, the auditorium was completely silent. Then the audience erupted in applause unlike anything the annual faculty talent show had ever heard. People leaped to their feet, cheering and whistling. The ovation went on with no sign of stopping. Rosa stood and bowed gracefully, the way she'd been trained to acknowledge applause in concert halls around the world. But her eyes were filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of coming home to herself after 20 years of exile. As she walked off stage, Rosa knew there would be questions. Her secret was out and her quiet, invisible life was over. But for the first time in 2 decades, that didn't frighten her. She had remembered who she was, and it felt like awakening from a very long dream. The applause seemed to go on forever. Rosa stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response, as 200 people rose to their feet in thunderous appreciation. She had performed in concert halls where audiences were more reserved, more sophisticated in their reactions. But there was something pure and honest about this ovation that moved her deeply. In the front row, she could see Professor Williams with tears streaming down his face. His mouth was still hanging open in shock. Next to him, Professor Chen was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt, her face glowing with amazement and pride. Dean Robertson herself was applauding from the side of the stage, her expression a mixture of astonishment and calculation. Rosa could almost see the wheels turning in the dean's mind as she realized what had just happened. As Rosa finally walked off stage, she was immediately surrounded by the other performers waiting in the wings. But now they looked at her completely differently. The casual camaraderie from earlier had been replaced by awe and confusion. "Rosa," Lisa, the graduate student, whispered, "where did you learn to play like that?" Before Rosa could answer, Professor Williams burst through the group, his face flushed with excitement and bewilderment. "Rosa, my God, what was that? That was, he seemed unable to find words. That was professional level. That was conservatory level. That was beyond anything I expected in my wildest dreams." More faculty members were pushing backstage now, all wanting to congratulate Rosa and ask questions. The remaining acts in the show seemed forgotten as everyone crowded around the woman they thought they knew. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean Robertson's voice came through the backstage chaos. "We need to continue with our program. Rosa, could you please wait in my office after the show? We need to talk." Rosa nodded, her heart still pounding from the performance and the aftermath. She could see the questions in everyone's eyes, but she was grateful for the temporary reprieve. The rest of the talent show continued, but the energy had completely changed. The remaining performers did their best, but everyone's mind was still on Rosa's stunning performance. Conversations in the audience buzzed with speculation and amazement. Did you know she could play like that? How is someone with that much talent working as a janitor? She must have professional training. You can't play Chopin like that without serious study. I've heard pianists at the symphony who weren't that good. In the audience, Rosa's fellow custodial workers sat in stunned pride. Janet, who had worked alongside Rosa for 2 years, kept shaking her head in amazement. "I knew she hummed while she worked," Janet whispered to her husband, "but I had no idea she was hiding something like this." The potential donors were having their own whispered conversations. Harold Peterson, a wealthy businessman who had been considering a modest contribution to the music program, was frantically texting his assistant to research Rosa Martinez. The performance they'd just witnessed suggested the music department had hidden depths he hadn't suspected. When the show finally ended, Rosa found herself in an awkward position. Half the audience wanted to congratulate her, while the other half seemed too intimidated to approach. She graciously accepted compliments and deflected questions as best she could, promising to explain more later. Professor Williams wouldn't leave her side. "Rosa, I have to know, where did you study? How long have you been playing? Why didn't you tell us?" "It's complicated," Rosa said gently. "I promise I'll explain everything, but the dean wants to see me first." Dean Robertson's office was elegant and intimidating, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and awards covering the walls. Rosa sat in a leather chair across from the dean's imposing desk, feeling like a student called to the principal's office. "Rosa," Dean Robertson began, her voice carefully controlled, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about who you really are." Rosa took a deep breath. The moment she'd been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. "What would you like to know? Let's start with where you learned to play piano like that. Because what I just witnessed wasn't someone who plays a little bit. That was the performance of someone with extensive professional training." Rosa nodded slowly. "You're right. I studied at the Moscow Conservatory. I had a performing career in Europe for several years." Dean Robertson leaned back in her chair, studying Rosa's face. "Under what name?" "Rosa Elena Volkov." The dean's eyes widened slightly. She reached for her computer and began typing. After a few moments, she turned the screen toward Rosa. It showed a young woman in an elegant concert dress, hands poised over piano keys with the caption, "Rising star Rosa Volkov wins international Chopin competition." "This is you," the dean said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. That was taken about 25 years ago." Dean Robertson scrolled through more search results. "It says here you performed with major orchestras across Europe. You recorded several albums. You were reviewed in international music publications." She looked up at Rosa with new respect and confusion. "What happened? How did you go from performing at Carnegie Hall to cleaning our floors?" Rosa told her story simply and honestly. The family tragedy, the impossible choice between career and responsibility, the years of caring for her mother and brother, the marriage and immigration, the gradual disappearance from the music world. "So you've been hiding this for 3 years, Dean Robertson said when Rosa finished. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to be treated differently," Rosa explained. "I didn't want pity or special consideration. I just wanted to do my job and finish my degree." "My performing career is in the past, is it?" the dean asked pointedly. "Because what I heard tonight suggests otherwise." Before Rosa could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Professor Williams peered in, his face still flushed with excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some people here who would like to meet Rosa." The dean nodded, and Professor Williams ushered in Harold Peterson and 2 other potential donors. They looked at Rosa with new interest and respect. "Ms. Martinez," Peterson said, "or should I say Ms. Volkov? That was an extraordinary performance. I've been to concerts at Lincoln Center that weren't half as moving." "Thank you." Rosa said simply. I have to ask, Peterson continued, would you be interested in performing more? Perhaps giving a recital for our donor appreciation events? I know several people who would pay handsomely to hear you play. Rosa glanced at Dean Robertson, who was watching the exchange with obvious interest. The dean had been trying to cultivate these donors for months, and here was Rosa accidentally accomplishing more in 20 minutes than elaborate presentations had achieved. I haven't really thought about performing again, Rosa said honestly. Well, think about it, Peterson urged. Someone with your talent shouldn't be hiding it. The world needs to hear music like that. After the donors left, Dean Robertson and Rosa sat in silence for a moment. You know, the dean said finally, we have an opening in our music faculty. Our piano instructor is retiring at the end of the semester. Would you be interested in teaching? Rosa felt her world shifting again. I don't have a teaching degree. You have something better. You have the credentials and experience that most of our faculty can only dream of. We can work around the formal requirements, but I'm not finished with my business degree. Dean Robertson smiled. Rosa, you just convinced 3 major donors to increase their contributions to our music program. You demonstrated that our college has hidden talents they never suspected. I think your future might lie in a different direction than business. As Rosa walked out of the dean's office an hour later, her head was spinning. Job offers, performance requests, interview requests from the local newspaper. Her quiet life had been turned completely upside down in one evening. But as she passed the main rehearsal hall where it all began, Rosa paused. Through the window, she could see the grand piano gleaming under the lights. Tomorrow she would still clean these floors and attend her evening classes. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time in 20 years, Rosa Elena Volkov was no longer hiding, and the world was ready to welcome her back. 3 months later, Rosa stood in front of her first piano class as Professor Rosa Martinez, adjunct faculty of music. The nameplate on her office door still felt surreal, but the nervous excitement in her students' faces was entirely familiar. Good morning, everyone, she said, settling at the piano bench in the main rehearsal hall. Before we begin, I want you to know that this classroom is a safe space for making mistakes. Music is about expression, not perfection. The transition hadn't been easy. After the talent show, Rosa's life changed overnight in ways she never expected. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the hidden virtuoso at Westfield College. The article was picked up by classical music blogs, and suddenly Rosa was getting emails from around the world. Some messages came from old colleagues who had wondered what happened to Rosa Elena Volkov. Others came from students wanting to study with her. A few came from concert promoters interested in booking her for performances. The most meaningful message came from Viktor Petrov, her old teacher at the Moscow Conservatory. Now in his 80s and retired, he had seen the newspaper article online. My dear Rosa, he wrote, I always wondered what became of my most promising student. I am sorry to learn of the struggles you endured, but I am not surprised by your choices. You always had the heart of an artist and the soul of a family woman. I am proud that you have found your way back to music even if it took 20 years. Remember what I always told you. Music is not about what you play, but how much of yourself you give to the playing. Dean Robertson had moved quickly to formalize Rosa's position. She arranged for Rosa to audit some education courses to meet teaching requirements, and helped her develop a curriculum that blended classical technique with practical musicianship. We're not just training concert pianists, the dean explained. We're teaching people to love music, whether they become professionals or play for their own joy. Rosa discovered she had a natural gift for teaching. Her own struggles and triumphs gave her patience with students who were discouraged, and her professional experience provided insights that textbooks couldn't offer. Her first student was actually Professor Williams' teenage daughter, Amy, who had been intimidated by piano lessons with more traditional teachers. I can't play like you, Amy said during their first lesson, after Rosa had demonstrated a piece. I don't want you to play like me, Rosa replied gently. I want you to play like you. My job is to help you find your own musical voice. Word of Rosa's teaching spread quickly. Within a month, she had a waiting list of students from both the college and the surrounding community. Parents drove from neighboring towns to bring their children to study with the famous piano teacher at Westfield. But Rosa was careful not to let her new position overshadow her core values. She continued working part-time in custodial services, partly because she needed the income while her teaching career developed, but mostly because she wanted to stay connected to the people who had supported her during her invisible years. "You don't have to clean floors anymore," Janet told her one day. "You're a professor now." "I'm still the same person," Rosa replied, mopping the music department hallway. "This work has dignity, just like teaching does." The hardest decision Rosa faced was whether to return to performing. Harold Peterson and other donors had organized a fundraising recital, with tickets selling for hundreds of dollars each. The proceeds would support music scholarships for low-income students. Rosa agreed, but only under specific conditions. The concert would be held in Westfield's auditorium, not a prestigious venue. Tickets would be available at multiple price points, so her custodial colleagues and students could attend. And the program would include both classical masterpieces and simpler pieces that showcased the beauty of accessible music. The night of the recital, Rosa stood backstage feeling the familiar pre-performance nerves she remembered from her youth. But this time, the anxiety was mixed with gratitude and purpose. She wasn't performing to advance her career or impress critics. She was playing to share music with people who had shown her kindness. The program opened with Bach's Goldberg Variations, pieces that required technical mastery, but spoke to universal human emotions. Rosa played them with the maturity that comes from experiencing both triumph and loss. The audience, a mix of wealthy donors, college faculty, students, and community members, listened in reverent silence. For her second set, Rosa chose Chopin Nocturnes, intimate pieces that showcased her interpretive skills. As she played, she thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much for Rosa's musical education. She thought about Miguel, who still clapped with delight when she played during her visits to his care facility. The evening concluded with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, with the Westfield Community Orchestra providing accompaniment under Professor Williams' direction. It was the same piece Rosa had recorded as a young woman, but her interpretation now carried decades of additional life experience. As the final notes faded, the audience rose in another thunderous ovation. But this time Rosa wasn't surprised or overwhelmed. She bowed gracefully, then gestured toward the orchestra, sharing the recognition with her colleagues. The recital raised enough money to fund 5 full scholarships. More importantly, it established Rosa as not just a former virtuoso hiding in obscurity, but as a committed educator and community member who happened to have extraordinary musical gifts. 6 months after the talent show that changed everything, Rosa had found a balance that eluded her in her first career. She taught students who reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She performed occasionally, always for meaningful causes. She maintained her connections to the practical, working-class world that had kept her grounded during her years away from music. Most importantly, she had learned that returning to music didn't mean abandoning the person she had become during her years of silence. The woman who had cleaned floors and taken night classes was still part of who she was. Her experiences as a caregiver, an immigrant, a working person had given her musical interpretations a depth and authenticity that her younger self, for all her technical brilliance, had lacked. Rosa kept one ritual from her custodial days. Every evening after her students had gone home, she would walk through the music department with a soft cloth, gently cleaning the piano keys in each practice room. It wasn't part of her job anymore, but it reminded her of where she had been and how far she had traveled. One evening, as she was finishing this routine, she found a note tucked under the strings of the grand piano. It was from Amy, Professor Williams's daughter, who had blossomed into a confident young pianist under Rosa's guidance. "Thank you for teaching me that music isn't about being perfect," the note read. "It's about being real. I hope someday I can give someone else the gift you gave me." Rosa smiled, folded the note carefully, and placed it in her wallet next to an old photo of herself performing at Carnegie Hall. Both images represented who she was: the young virtuoso and the mature teacher, the international performer and the woman who had chosen family over fame. As she locked up the music building for the night, Rosa reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had thought her story ended when she left the concert stage 20 years ago, but it turned out that was just the end of one chapter. The real story, The one about finding your way home to yourself was just beginning. The next morning, Rosa would return to teach her students, to share her love of music with a new generation, and to prove every day that it's never too late to reclaim the dreams you thought you had lost forever. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from perfect technique, but from a heart that has learned to sing again after years of silence.